Keanu Reeves had driven this route every morning for years. The same stretch of road, the same set of stoplights, the same quiet neighborhood he passed through on his way to work. But there was one thing that had always stood out during his daily drive. Her. Every single day, without fail, a young woman named Sarah stood at the same corner, just past the small coffee shop. Each time Keanu drove by, she would wave. It wasn't anything grand, no wild gestures or desperate attempts to grab his attention. Just a simple, friendly wave, like a small ritual that had somehow become part of his routine. But today, when he drove past that corner, Sarah wasn't there. Keanu felt an odd, unfamiliar twist in his gut. He slowed down, unsure why her absence hit him so hard. It was a fleeting moment, just a few seconds of hesitation, but it lingered. He didn't know her. They had never spoken. She was just a girl who waved every morning, and yet somehow it felt wrong. Why wasn't she there? The logical part of his mind tried to brush it off. It was just a missed day. Maybe she was sick or had something else to do. But the rest of him, the part that couldn't ignore that strange gut feeling, wondered if something was wrong. Had something happened to her? His thoughts raced. Keanu. Couldn't recall ever seeing her on any other days, not when he was in a rush or distracted by other things. It was always a brief, quiet connection, just the wave. But now, the absence of it seemed louder than the usual greeting. He told himself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe he was overthinking it. But as he continued down the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe I should check on her, he thought. Before he could convince himself otherwise, the decision was made. Keanu wasn't the type to intrude on people's lives, but today, something was pushing him to make sure she was okay. He turned the corner and drove to where she usually stood. As he passed the street, he caught a glimpse of the coffee shop, empty except for the usual barista behind the counter, but there was no sign of Sarah. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Keanu couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. After his drive through the neighborhood that morning, the absence of her wave lingered with him all day. It was as if something had been missing from his routine, a small, insignificant detail that, until now, had been a comforting part of his life. But why did it matter so much? Keanu had seen her only in passing, just a fleeting moment every morning. There wasn't even much to remember about her, except for the wave, of course. A soft, simple wave. She seemed to be in her late 20s, always dressed in jeans and a jacket, hair tied back loosely in a ponytail. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a regular girl living in the same quiet neighborhood he passed through each day. He tried to shrug it off. It wasn't like he had ever spoken to her, or even exchanged more than a smile. It was just a wave, a gesture that seemed to say, "I see you." And that small act had somehow become a part of his morning ritual. But today, there was a void. Keanu found himself stopping more often at the coffee shop just to peek out the window, hoping to spot her standing at the corner. He didn't want to admit it, but he was worried. Sarah had been there for so long, day in and day out. He hadn't realized how deeply the small act of her wave had embedded itself into his routine. That afternoon, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He pulled up to the coffee shop after work, parked and walked across the street to the corner where Sarah always stood. He half expected her to be there, just waiting for him to drive by again as if nothing had changed. But she wasn't. Keanu took a deep breath and walked into the small bookstore next to the corner. He wasn't sure why he was here. Maybe he thought someone might know where she had gone or if she was okay, but he wasn't sure how to ask. After all, they weren't friends. They were strangers. Inside the store, the smell of old paper and coffee filled the air. The store was quiet, with only a few customers browsing the shelves. The cashier, a middle-aged man with glasses, looked up from his book as Keanu approached. "Hey, do you happen to know a girl who works around here? She's around my neighborhood." Keanu started awkwardly, unsure how to explain. The cashier raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by Keanu's unusual question. "A girl?" "Yeah, her name's Sarah. She's around the corner by the coffee shop. You might have seen her. She's usually waving at me when I drive by." The cashier frowned slightly, rubbing his chin. "I haven't seen her around in a few days. I think she stopped coming to work recently. She mentioned something about needing a break. But I'm not sure. I don't know where she went." Keanu felt a surge of concern. "Do you know where she lives?" The cashier hesitated before nodding slowly. "She lives in the apartment building down the street, 221B. It's a small place, but she's been there a while. I think she's dealing with something personal, but I can't say for sure. She's a nice girl, though." Keanu thanked him and left the store, the information hanging in the air like a weight. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. Some vague answer that only made him more confused. Sarah had been such a consistent part of his mornings, yet now she was an enigma, and the mystery only deepened the longer he thought about it. He stood on the street corner for a moment, unsure what to do next. There was no sign of her, no indication of where she had gone or why she had suddenly stopped coming to the corner. All he knew was that he had to find out. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It had been 2 days since he last saw Sarah at the corner. The unease in his gut had grown into a quiet obsession. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the empty corner, the unacknowledged wave. There was something about her absence. That felt unsettling in a way he couldn't explain. He parked his car near the apartment building the cashier had mentioned, 221B, a nondescript complex with a faded sign and ivy creeping up the side of the brick building. Keanu stared at the building for a moment, his mind racing with questions. What was really going on with her? Why hadn't she come out in days? The answers felt just out of reach, like a puzzle missing a few key pieces. He stood there, trying to gather his thoughts. Was he really about to knock on a stranger's door? Was it strange to be so concerned about someone he barely knew? But the thought of Sarah, standing on that corner every day waiting to wave at him, made him feel like he couldn't just let this go. Keanu sighed, resigned to his impulse. He took a deep breath, walked up to the entrance, and found the buzzer for her apartment, 221B. He pressed it and waited, listening to the faint buzz on the other side. No one answered. He pressed it again. Still nothing. Just as he was about to leave, Keanu heard footsteps. The door creaked open, and a woman in her mid-30s appeared in the doorway. She had a warm, tired smile that didn't quite reach her. "Eyes? Yes?" she asked, her voice soft. Keanu paused for a second, feeling awkward. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for Sarah. I live in the neighborhood, and I noticed I haven't seen her around lately." The woman's expression shifted. For a moment she looked uncertain, as if weighing whether to let him in on something. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter now. "Sarah's not here at the moment. She's been unwell. She took some time off work." Keanu felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Is she okay?" The woman's eyes softened with a touch of sadness. "She's been dealing with something personal. She didn't want anyone to know, but she's not in a good place. I think she's been avoiding people, even her friends. She's a little reclusive right now." Keanu wasn't sure what to make of this. There was something about her tone, something behind her words that didn't quite add up. But he also understood that Sarah was likely going through something difficult, something she didn't want to share with anyone. "Do you know when she'll be back?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual, but the anxiety in his chest made it hard to hide his concern. The woman shook her head. "I wish I could say. She's not ready to talk to anyone yet, but maybe you should give her some time. She'll reach out when she's ready." Keanu nodded slowly. He felt like he had hit a dead end, but at the same time, he couldn't help but feel more connected to Sarah than ever. "Okay, thanks for letting me know," he said, turning to leave. But just before he walked away, he turned back. "Is there anything I can do to help? Anything at all?" The woman paused, her gaze drifting to the ground for a moment, as if debating something. Finally, she said, "Maybe just let her know that someone's thinking about her. She might appreciate that." Keanu left the building, his mind racing with thoughts and questions. What had Sarah been going through? What was she hiding from him and everyone? He didn't know why it felt so important to find out, but something deep inside him urged him to push forward. The more he thought about her absence, the more his instincts told him there was something more to this than just a mist wave. There was a reason she wasn't at the corner. He just didn't know what it was yet. The next morning, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He couldn't get Sarah out of his mind, and the more he thought about her absence, the more questions started to flood his mind. Was she really unwell, as the woman in the building had suggested? Or was something more serious going on? His routine was already off kilter. For weeks, every morning had been the same. Drive down the road, past the coffee shop, see Sarah standing at the corner, wave, and continue on. It had been so predictable, so comforting in its consistency, that now, without that simple gesture, it felt as though something was missing, something he couldn't fully explain. So despite the uncertainty, Keanu found himself back at the corner the next day, driving slowly as he scanned the street. He knew deep down that he shouldn't be doing this. He was just a stranger to her after all, but he couldn't help it. He needed to know if Sarah was okay. As he rounded the corner near the coffee shop, he noticed something different. The street seemed quieter than usual. The wind was still and there was no sign of Sarah as expected. But this time there was something else. A man was standing on the sidewalk looking around as though he was searching for something, or someone. Keanu's instincts kicked in and he slowed the car. The man had an unfamiliar air about him. He was tall with dark, messy hair and a worn-out leather jacket. His demeanor was cautious, almost like he was watching for someone, or trying not to be seen. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, his gaze scanning the area as though he was waiting for a signal. Keanu's curiosity got the better of him. He parked the car and got out, walking toward the coffee shop, trying to keep his distance from the man. He didn't want to make it obvious that he was watching. But his mind was racing, trying to piece together what he had seen. As he approached the door to the coffee shop, he paused for a moment. He could feel the man's eyes on him, and it sent a shiver down his spine. Something was off. The whole situation felt wrong. Just then the man turned and walked in the opposite direction, disappearing around the corner. Keanu's heart raced, but he couldn't bring himself to follow. Instead, he stepped inside the coffee shop, his thoughts still swirling. He ordered his usual black coffee and a muffin, and took a seat by the window, where he could keep an eye on the corner. Maybe he would spot Sarah, or maybe he would see the man again. As he sipped his coffee, his mind wandered back to the conversation he'd had with the woman in the apartment building. Sarah had been avoiding people. She was going through something personal. The idea of her shutting herself off from the world made him uneasy. Was she in danger? Was there more to her story than he realized? Keanu looked out the window, still scanning the street. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement across the road. There she was. Sarah stood in the middle of the street, almost as if waiting for something, or someone. She didn't notice Keanu at first, but he recognized her immediately. She looked different, though. Her expression was tense, her shoulders stiff as if she was on edge. She was still wearing the same jacket, but there was something about her demeanor that felt distant, like she wasn't fully present. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, but before he could leave the coffee shop, Sarah turned and began walking down the street. She didn't notice him. She didn't seem to notice anything at all. For a moment, Keanu debated whether to approach her. What would he say? He didn't want to intrude, but seeing her like this, looking so lost and distant, made him feel like he had to do something. He grabbed his jacket, paid for his coffee, and followed her. The street was quiet, with only a few pedestrians strolling along. Sarah walked at a slow pace, her head down, her footsteps heavy. Keanu kept his distance, trying not to make it obvious that he was following her. She took a turn down a narrow alley, and Keanu hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The alley was dark, and there was a sense of foreboding in the air. But he couldn't stop now. He had to know what was going on. Keanu continued down the alley, but as he rounded the corner, he froze. Sarah was standing in front of a door he had never noticed before. The building was old, almost abandoned looking, and the door itself was covered in graffiti. Sarah was staring at it, her hand hovering over the knob, as though she was unsure whether to enter. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. What was she doing here? Why was she standing in front of this place, looking so lost? Suddenly, Sarah turned around. She hadn't seen him yet, but Keanu quickly stepped back, trying to blend into the shadows. She walked past him, not noticing him at all. She seemed to be in a trance, her mind far away from everything around her. As she passed, Keanu's heart ached with worry. There was something deeply wrong, something that didn't add up. And in that moment, Keanu realized that Sarah's disappearance wasn't just an accident. She was hiding something. And whatever it was leading her down a dark path. Keanu stood frozen in the shadows, watching Sarah disappear down the alley, her steps slow and deliberate. He was overwhelmed by a sudden surge of both curiosity and concern. What was she doing? Why was she at this old, abandoned-looking building? There had to be an explanation. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fit together, but they didn't make sense. Nothing about this situation made sense. As Sarah continued walking further down the alley, Keanu quickly gathered his thoughts and decided to follow. He moved quietly, doing his best to keep out of sight. She was clearly lost in her own world. Her pace unhurried, but he had no idea where she was headed. The door she had stopped at was like a hidden relic of another time, graffiti-covered and neglected, blending into the decay around it. There was something about that door that didn't sit right with him, something almost too deliberate. Keanu kept his distance, making sure Sarah couldn't spot him. He wasn't sure why, but he felt compelled to know what was behind that door. He wasn't trying to be a hero or get involved in her life. It was just that after days of thinking about her absence, seeing her like this, he felt like he needed to understand, to do something, anything. Sarah walked to the end of the alley and disappeared into a narrow street. Keanu, now closer to the door, took a moment to inspect it. The graffiti was mostly faded, some tags looking like they had been there for years. The door itself was old, heavy and covered in rust. The only thing that seemed unusual was the lock. It wasn't a typical rusty lock like the rest of the building's worn-down features. It was a new, high-tech digital lock. Keanu frowned. That didn't fit. This building looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet the door had been recently updated. Why would Sarah be standing in front of it like that, looking so lost? He looked around the alley, making sure no one else was there. It was deserted, the only sound being the distant hum of traffic in the background. There was a moment of hesitation before he reached out and touched the lock, his fingers brushing over the smooth surface of the keypad. He wasn't sure why he felt the urge to investigate further, but the pull was undeniable. Before he could stop himself, he pressed a few random numbers on the keypad. To his surprise, the lock clicked open, the door creaking slightly as it swung inward. His heart raced in his chest. What the hell? Keanu glanced over his shoulder again, but the alley remained empty. He took a deep breath, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. Part of him screamed to leave, to walk away before things got too complicated, but the other part, the part that had been worried about Sarah all this time, urged him to step inside. He pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges groaning as the heavy wood moved. The room on the other side was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering bulb above. Keanu's eyes adjusted to the low light, revealing an unexpected sight. Stacks of boxes, old furniture, and various pieces of equipment scattered around the room. It looked like some sort of storage area, but there was a sense of eeriness to it. The air felt thick with dust, and the walls were lined with faded photographs and strange symbols drawn on paper. Keanu stepped inside cautiously, his mind racing. What was this place? Why had Sarah brought him here, even if only in spirit? He felt a deep unease settle in his stomach. There was something unsettling about the room, like a hidden part of the world that wasn't meant to be discovered. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around, heart in his throat, ready to face whoever had followed him into the room, but there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped, and everything was still. Keanu's breath caught in his chest. He could feel his pulse racing. Was it just his imagination, or had someone else entered the room? He tried to shake off the feeling, but the sense of being watched refused to leave. He took a step further into the room, now fully aware of the quiet tension that hung in the air. As his eyes scanned the dark corners, something caught his attention, a piece of paper pinned to the wall with a red string. Keanu approached it cautiously, his gaze narrowing as he saw the words written in bold black letters. "Do not trust them." His throat tightened. The message felt chilling, as if someone had known what was going to happen, as if someone had been warning him all along. He looked around again, scanning the room more closely. The strange symbols, the photos, and now, this cryptic message. It all felt like a secret he wasn't meant to uncover, and yet everything inside him told him that he was getting closer to the truth. Keanu's hand hovered over the paper, but before he could touch it, a soft voice came from behind him. "You shouldn't be here." Keanu spun around quickly, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. There, standing in the doorway, was Sarah. She looked different than before. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. The same girl he had seen waving at him every morning was now standing before him, her presence more unsettling than comforting. Sarah took a hesitant step into the room, her eyes darting nervously to the walls, to the strange symbols, and then back to Keanu. "Sarah," Keanu whispered, his voice filled with surprise and concern. "What is this place? Why didn't you tell anyone you were—" "I didn't want anyone to know," she interrupted, her voice shaky. "But now it's too late. You're here, and I can't let you get involved." She took a step back, her eyes pleading. "You don't know who they are. You don't understand what's happening." Keanu's mind raced. There was so much to take in. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Sarah to be here, let alone act so frightened. "Who are they?" Keanu asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah shook her head quickly. "I can't tell you. It's not safe." But it was already too late. Keanu was in it now, pulled into a world of secrets, and he knew he couldn't back out. Sarah's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The mystery that had drawn him here, to this abandoned building with strange symbols and cryptic messages, had just deepened in a way he wasn't prepared for. He stepped forward, trying to meet Sarah's gaze. "What are you talking about? What's going on here? You're scaring me." Sarah's eyes darted around the room, her body tense as though she was trying to calculate how much she could tell him without putting him in danger. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself to speak. "I don't have much time to explain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to listen, Keanu. This isn't just about me anymore. There's something much bigger going on, something you're not supposed to know." Keanu's mind raced as he processed her words. He was in over his head. He had come here out of concern for her, but now he felt like he was being pulled into something dark and dangerous. He had no idea what kind of world Sarah had been living in, but it was clear that whatever it was more complicated than a simple mist wave. "I don't understand," Keanu said, shaking his head in frustration. I've been worried about you. You stopped coming to the corner and I thought something had happened to you. Now you're telling me there's some secret, some danger I don't know about?" Sarah nodded, but there was no relief in her face. If anything, she looked more terrified than ever. "Keanu, I didn't want to get you involved, but now that you're here, you need to know the truth. There are people, dangerous people, who have been watching me for months. They want something from me, and they won't stop until they get it." The words hit Keanu like a punch to the gut. "What do they want with you?" Sarah paused, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "I don't know everything, but I've seen things. Things that I can't explain. They're involved in something that doesn't make sense. I've tried to get away from them, but they always find me. They know everything about me, where I live, where I go, who I talk to." She clenched her fists, her knuckles white. "And now they know you too." Keanu felt his heart race. "What do you mean? They know me?" She took a deep breath, lowering her voice as she spoke again. "You've been waving at me every day, right? For months. I thought it was just a silly routine at first, something that brought me comfort. But now I realize it was part of their plan. They've been watching you, Keanu. They've been watching us both." A chill ran down Keanu's spine as he realized the weight of her words. This wasn't just a case of a friendly wave anymore. It wasn't a coincidence. It was all part of something much larger than he could have imagined. "Who are they?" Keanu asked, his voice shaking slightly. "What do they want with us?" Sarah shook her head again, her expression darkening. "I don't know all the answers, but I do know one thing. They're not who they appear to be. They can disguise themselves, change their faces, manipulate people. And they've been doing it for years. I've seen their work, I've seen what they can do, and now they're getting closer." The room felt smaller, darker as Sarah spoke. Keanu could feel the weight of her words pressing in on him. He couldn't tell if she was trying to warn him or protect him, but he couldn't help feeling like there was more she wasn't saying. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Sarah didn't answer. She stood there, her body trembling slightly, as if she was afraid of what might happen next. Then, slowly, she spoke again. "We need to go. We need to leave this place and get out of the city before they find us." Keanu stared at her, a million thoughts racing through his mind. Leave the city? Was she serious? Where will we go? How do we even... Before he could finish, Sarah's head snapped to the side, her eyes wide with fear. She quickly grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the back of the room, where a small staircase led to a second floor. "Now," she hissed. "We don't have time to waste." Keanu's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what was going on, but something told him he had no choice but to follow. They rushed up the stairs, Sarah leading the way. The upper floor was even darker, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room was sparse except for a desk in the corner covered with papers, photographs, and files. "This is where I've been keeping everything," Sarah said, as she quickly went through a drawer, pulling out a manila folder. "I've been trying to piece together what's been happening to me. But it's all connected. The people who've been following me, the strange symbols, the messages, everything." She opened the folder, revealing a set of photographs and notes. "I've been tracking their movements. I've been trying to figure out who they really are. But they're always one step ahead." Keanu leaned in, his eyes scanning the documents. In one of the photos, he saw a group of people standing in front of a building, all wearing dark suits. There was something about their faces, something off about their expressions. They looked like ordinary people, but Keanu felt an inexplicable sense of dread as he stared at the image. "These people," Sarah whispered, "they're not human." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. He looked up at her, searching for some kind of explanation. "What do you mean, not human?" But before she could answer, there was a loud crash from downstairs. Someone was coming. The sound of footsteps echoed from the floor below, fast and heavy, as if someone or something was closing in on them. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. The calmness he had tried to maintain suddenly vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. Sarah grabbed his arm tightly, her fingers digging into his skin. "They're here," she whispered urgently. "We have to go, now." Keanu nodded, trying to steady his breath. The fear in her voice was palpable, and it only made the gravity of the situation sink deeper into his bones. He had no idea what he was walking into, but whatever it was much bigger than he could have ever imagined. His mind raced as he followed Sarah toward the back of the room, his eyes darting nervously between the door and the narrow hallway beyond. They rushed down the hall, Sarah leading the way as she checked every corner before moving on. Keanu's mind kept spiraling with questions, but there was no time for answers. Not now. "Where are we going?" he asked between breaths. Sarah didn't slow down, her pace unrelenting. "There's a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a place they won't think to look. We'll be safe there, but we need to hurry." Keanu barely had time to process her words when the crash came again. This time, it was closer, and it sent a chill through his body. The sound wasn't just the noise of heavy footsteps, it was the sound of someone forcing their way through the building, breaking down whatever stood in their path. "We have to get out," Sarah urged, her voice shaking. They burst through a door at the end of the hall, emerging into a dark stairwell that descended into the building's depths. Sarah motioned for him to follow. "Downstairs, we'll slip out the back." Keanu's mind was still reeling. Everything was happening so fast. 1 minute he had been standing at his window, waving to Sarah like he always did. The next, he was running for his life, deep inside an abandoned building with no idea who was after him or why. What had Sarah gotten herself into, and why was he, the one who was being dragged into it? But there was no time for second guessing. His instincts kicked in. The noise was getting closer. They had no time to waste. They reached the bottom of the stairs where a faint light came from a cracked door at the far end. Sarah was already moving toward it, her steps quick and quiet. She reached for the door handle, but before she could open it, another crash rang through the air, shaking the walls around them. Keanu froze. The door at the end of the hallway was now swinging open, revealing a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, the dim light revealing a cold, unreadable face. For a brief moment, Keanu thought he saw a flicker of recognition in the stranger's eyes, almost as if they had been expecting him. But that feeling was gone in an instant. Sarah. The figure growled. "Where are you going?" Sarah didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open, shoving Keanu through it and into the narrow alley behind the building. "Run!" she shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. Keanu didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted into the alley, the cold night air biting at their skin as they ran. His heart was pounding so loudly in his chest that it almost drowned out the sound of their footsteps. Sarah's breath was quick and shallow, but she didn't slow down. She kept pushing him forward, the alley twisting and turning in a maze-like fashion. Keanu had no idea where they were headed. He just hoped it was far enough. They ran for what felt like an eternity, but then, just as Keanu thought they might be in the clear, a loud crash rang out behind them, followed by the sound of heavy boots pounding the ground. The figure from the building was following them. "Go left," Sarah shouted suddenly, pulling Keanu toward a narrow street that barely seemed wide enough to fit both of them. They rounded the corner, and Keanu glanced behind them to see 2 more figures emerging from the alley, blocking their path. They were closing in on them from both sides. "Sarah, what is this?" Keanu gasped, his chest tightening as fear set in. "Who are these people?" "I told you they aren't human," Sarah cried, panic evident in her voice. But before she could finish, there was a loud crack followed by the sudden blinding flash of light that enveloped the alley. Keanu flinched, trying to shield his eyes, but the light was too intense. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished and everything fell silent. Keanu opened his eyes slowly, squinting as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. When his vision cleared, he realized they were no longer in the alley. The night had been replaced with a brightly lit room, an underground space with high-tech equipment lining the walls. Sarah's grip on his arm had loosened, and she was staring at the space in front of them, wide-eyed and terrified. Keanu's mind raced. Where were they? What had just happened? A voice rang out from behind them, sharp and commanding. "Don't move." Keanu spun around, and his blood ran cold. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure from the alley, the one who had been chasing them. But now something was different. The person in front of him wasn't human, not in the way Keanu understood. Their features were smooth, almost metallic, their skin a pale, unnatural hue. The eyes that stared back at him were a pale, almost glowing white. This wasn't the same person from the alley. "This is the end of the road," the figure said, coldly stepping closer. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. Everything had changed. And whatever he thought he knew about Sarah, about his life, it was all unraveling. The figure in front of Keanu and Sarah stepped forward, its movement eerily smooth, like someone who had practiced this every day of their life. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. The fear that had once been distant now engulfed him entirely. He felt trapped, as though there was no escape from the cold, metallic eyes that were now locked on him. Sarah squeezed Keanu's arm, her grip tightening. "Don't let them take us," she whispered urgently. Keanu didn't understand what was happening. Everything felt surreal, like he had stepped into a nightmare. A second ago, they were in an alley, running for their lives, and now they were in a high-tech underground facility with a stranger, or was it a stranger, who clearly had no intention of letting them go. The metallic figure spoke again, its voice hollow, mechanical. "You've seen too much. You're involved now." Sarah, Keanu whispered, his voice trembling. What is this? What are they? What are we doing here? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the figure, her face pale with fear. Finally, she turned to Keanu, her eyes full of regret. I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't want you to be dragged into this world. But now you're here and there's no going back. Keanu was about to ask more, but the figure interrupted, stepping closer to them. Enough questions. You both need to come with us. Suddenly, without warning, the room around them lit up with a strange energy. A hum filled the air, and Keanu felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The metallic figure was now joined by several others, each one equally cold and lifeless, their glowing eyes scanning them as if calculating every move. Sarah pulled Keanu back, her eyes wild with panic. "Run!" she shouted, and before Keanu could fully process her words, she grabbed his hand and yanked him toward a narrow hallway that stretched into darkness. They sprinted down the hallway, the sounds of their pursuers' footsteps growing, louder behind them. Keanu's breath came in short bursts, his mind in overdrive, trying to piece together everything he had learned in the last few hours. Sarah was running ahead of him, her face a mask of determination. But there was something else there, a sense of deep fear, one that she couldn't fully hide. They reached another door and Sarah didn't hesitate. She slammed it open, pulling Keanu inside. The moment they stepped through, the door slammed shut behind them with an echo that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Keanu was panting heavily, and he looked around, trying to make sense of where they were. It was a room, plain and simple, but there were papers scattered everywhere. Documents, photographs, maps, and strange blueprints that looked completely alien. Sarah didn't give him a chance to look at them for long. She immediately began rifling through the papers, her hands trembling. Keanu opened his mouth to ask more questions, but Sarah raised her hand to stop him. "Keanu, you have to understand something," she said, her voice breaking. "Everything you think you know is a lie. The people we've been running from, they're not human." "They never were." Keanu's stomach twisted. "What do you mean they're not human? Who are they?" Sarah paused, her fingers brushing over a particular set of documents before she turned to face him. There was something in her eyes now, something heavy. "They are part of an organization, no, a group, that's been operating for decades. They're not just some secret government agency or underground cult. They've been manipulating humanity for centuries, and it's not just about control. It's about survival." Keanu felt a chill run through him. "Survival? What do you mean?" Sarah's eyes shifted, almost as if she was afraid of saying the words out loud, but she didn't hesitate. "They're not human. They're an advanced race. They've been living among us for so long that we no longer know who's one of them and who's not. They've evolved to the point where they can manipulate their genetic makeup, take on human appearances, control minds, even erase memories." Keanu stared at her in disbelief. "You're telling me that the people who've been chasing us, they're aliens?" Sarah nodded, her face grim. "Yes, and they're looking for something, someone, and that someone is me." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. "What? Why?" "Because I'm not like them," she explained quickly. "I'm different. I was born with abilities they never expected. And now they're desperate to find me and control me. They've tried to take me before and I've barely escaped, but I never knew they'd come for you too." She looked at Keanu, her eyes filled with guilt. "I never meant for you to get dragged into this. But now that you've seen it, now that they know you're involved, they won't stop. They'll do anything to keep their secret hidden, and they'll stop at nothing to silence us both." Keanu was still trying to process everything she had just told him. His mind couldn't quite grasp it all. He'd always thought of Sarah as just a kind, ordinary woman, a wave here and there. But now, everything had changed. Nothing made sense anymore. "I don't understand," Keanu said, shaking his head. "If they're so powerful, why didn't they just take us already?" Sarah looked at him with a bitter smile. "Because they wanted you to see. They wanted you to witness it. You're not just a bystander in this, Keanu. You're a part of it now." Before Keanu could respond, they both heard the unmistakable sound of the metallic footsteps from the hallway. The figures were coming closer. "We have to go," Sarah said urgently, grabbing his arm again and pulling him toward a small hatch in the floor. "This is our only way out." Keanu followed, but his mind was racing. His life, his entire reality, had just been turned upside down. He wasn't just some guy who waved at a woman on the street. He was now part of something huge and incredibly dangerous. The chase had only just begun. Keanu's heart raced as Sarah pulled him through the hatch and into the darkness below. They descended quickly, the cold air of the underground facility biting at their skin. He could hear the metallic footsteps growing fainter above them, but that only gave him a fleeting sense of relief. He knew it wasn't over. The chase wasn't. Finished? Not by a long shot. "Where are we going?" Keanu asked, his voice strained. "What's the plan?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she led him through a labyrinth of tunnels that seemed to stretch endlessly into the unknown. The walls were lined with strange, glowing symbols, none of which Keanu could even begin to understand. The further they went, the more the world above seemed to fade away. They were descending into a different reality altogether. After what felt like an eternity, they came to a stop in front of a steel door. Sarah placed her hand on a small panel next to it, and with a soft beep the door slid open, revealing a stark white room. "This is it," Sarah said quietly, turning to Keanu. "This is the place where everything changes." Keanu's mind raced. What had she meant by that? He was already too deep in this to turn back, but what was going to happen here? Why had they come to this strange, isolated room? Before he could voice his questions, Sarah moved quickly to a console in the center of the room. She typed something in, her fingers moving swiftly over the screen. "There's a system here, an old one," Sarah said. "It has information, everything. About them, about what they've been doing, about me." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "It can help us stop them, but only if we can unlock it." Keanu's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. This was the moment where they either won or lost. He felt the weight of it settle deep within him. There was no going back now. "Sarah," Keanu said, stepping closer to her, "what happens if we can't unlock it? What if we can't stop them?" Her eyes met his, a flicker of vulnerability passing through her otherwise stoic expression. "Then everything we've been through will have been for nothing," she said softly. "And they'll keep doing what they've been doing. They'll continue to control everything." Keanu nodded, the gravity of her words sinking in. There was no choice but to push forward. He had already come this far for Sarah, for himself, and for whatever future they could still have. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a resounding crash, and the lights flickered. Keanu spun around, his pulse spiking. They weren't alone anymore. Figures appeared in the doorway. Dozens of them, all wearing the same cold metallic expressions, the same glowing eyes. The same eerie, otherworldly presence that made Keanu's skin crawl. "Step away from the console," one of the figures said in a voice that sounded like a mixture of metal and human. "No," Sarah shouted, stepping in front of Keanu protectively. "You won't stop us this time." Keanu could feel the energy shift in the room. It was as if the air itself had grown thick with tension. The metallic figures didn't move, but Keanu knew they were waiting. Waiting for Sarah to make a mistake. Waiting for her to give in. But she didn't. "I won't let you control me anymore," she said, her voice steady now, filled with a determination that Keanu had never seen in her before. "Sarah," Keanu whispered, his eyes wide with both admiration and fear. "What are you going to do?" Without answering, Sarah moved quickly toward the console, her fingers flying over the keys. The figures seemed to hesitate, as if uncertain of what she was doing. The sound of the keys clicking filled the room, almost deafening in the silence. Then, without warning, a loud whirring noise filled the room and the walls lit up in a flash of bright, pulsing light. The metallic figures flinched as if the light had physically struck them, and Keanu felt a rush of power surge through the hair. The figures began to back away, their glowing eyes flickering as they tried to resist whatever was happening. "What are you doing?" one of them growled, its voice suddenly panicked. "I'm stopping you," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "This ends now." Keanu stood in awe, realizing that everything Sarah had told him was true. She wasn't just some ordinary woman. She was a force in her own right, a power capable of fighting back against these beings. The room crackled with energy as Sarah continued her work, typing commands into the console with an intensity that seemed almost otherworldly. But the metallic figures weren't going to go down without a fight. They began to advance, their steps quick and determined. "Sarah," Keanu shouted, grabbing her arm, "we need to go now." But Sarah shook her head, her gaze never leaving the screen. "I can't," she said, her voice strained. To finish this, I have to stop them once and for all." Before Keanu could respond, the metallic figures lunged forward, and a battle erupted in the room. Keanu barely had time to react as one of the figures grabbed him by the wrist, pulling him away from Sarah. The cold, unnatural strength of the figure was enough to make his bones ache. But just as he was about to be thrown aside, Sarah shouted, her voice echoing through the room, "Keanu, now!" She slammed her hand down on the console one last time, and the room erupted in a blinding flash of light. For a moment, everything was drowned in white. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering and distorting as if the light was ripping them apart. Keanu closed his eyes against the brightness, and when he opened them again, everything was different. The metallic figures were gone. The room had returned to its previous state of eerie silence. Keanu felt a strange stillness wash over him, as if the air had cleared. Sarah stood in front of the console, breathing heavily, but with a look of triumph on her face. "We did it," she said quietly. "It's over." Keanu took a step toward her, his heart still racing. "Is it really over?" Sarah nodded, her eyes softening as she turned to face him. "Yes, we've won." But Keanu knew that the world they had just stepped into was far from normal. The truth had been revealed, and their lives would never be the same again. The chase, the danger, and everything that came with it had changed them forever. And yet, in the midst of all the chaos, Keanu realized that he wasn't alone. He had Sarah. They had fought together, and somehow they had come out victorious. But deep down, he knew that their story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Hit subscribe. And leave a comment with where you're watching from.